so we stop on the hour. Okay, folks, let's kind of rock and roll onwards, as they say. There are meant to be 2 presenters for this particular session. My colleague Claire is unfortunately not able to join us. She opted instead to go to a wedding in Italy. I have no idea why. but what I'd like to talk about is the experience behind a tiny bit of research that we were involved in last year. How it came about, and the goals that it rocked, in a sense, because it took us into space that I've not been in myself before, despite the fact that I've been working in this area for up to 20 years. Okay, so some of you will know me. Some of you will be in the room will know me, and some of you will not. My name is Conor Galvin. I'm based in the University College Dublin, and I spend a lot of time researching in the digital spaces, looking at ICT, looking at technology, and so on. The kinds of work that I would do would relate to things like value in education. This is a piece that we produced a number of years ago. I'm also very, very kind of concerned and looking at what goes on in classrooms, how teachers use technology, and how students use technology. It's much easier to check and to chase and to ask questions about how teachers use technology than students and pupils, because there are all sorts of ethical issues involved. And somebody like me comes in from the outside. And teachers look at their own research, look at their own situations, but they do an awful lot more. And maybe that's just one of the takeaways from today. So I've been involved in producing books like this down through the years. This was a study that we did around 2009, 2010 of e-twinning. And if you've not been involved in e-twinning previously, I can't recommend it too much. It's a superb way in for technology and for using technology, starting points for technology in typical classrooms, both primary and second level classrooms. This is more my natural environment. I work extensively with students who are at the graduate level. So people who are on what used to be called the ordinary diploma, what's now called a PM, which is now going to become a master's in the next while, and increasingly people in doctoral schools and in master's level work. That's where I am more at home. So these kinds of questions are the things I deal with on a daily basis. It's nice to see one of my own students in the room. Probably heard some of this before, but which tells me afterwards. I also advise about 5 or 6 people every year in relation to what you might call small-scale pieces of research. And those of you who are kind of long-established CESI heads will recognize the venue there. That's a particular group of my students who came a couple of years ago to the CESI conference in Location. And again, it's something that I try to encourage because I think students should be plugged into what's going on at the practice level. It's very important that they come to sessions like this and meet people like you. So I think it's about 5 here this year from my cohort. The immediate piece of work we're going to be talking about today is again one of these small-scale pieces, which 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you can get a bit careless. You can lose, you can lose the edge from time to time. And then suddenly a student comes along and asks a question that absolutely upturns your appetite, as they say, makes your letters. All right? But Claire came into the program last year. She came from a psychology perspective. I'm not used to dealing with psychologists. Education psychologists are otherwise. They see the world through a different lens. And Claire made that very clear from the very beginning when she started this piece of work. So those are her research objectives. This is what she set out to do. I'm not going to label them, but they're pretty typical enough. If you have a quick look through, nothing terribly scary there. It's the sort of stuff that you would set up a piece of research to look at. The impact of the various agents involved, and again, this chimes a little with what Leo was saying earlier about how you take that forward, how you move it up the scale. Then the key events and actions which need to be done to bring technologies into schools, the challenges, the implications, the good stuff and the bad stuff, what helps and what hinders. So again, nothing terribly complicated. And I was giving her what I hate to say is kind of my normal line. I was saying, yeah, this is good, and it was very good. I was saying, when you do stuff with this, you can talk to one or two teachers, you can do this, and this. And she said, yeah, and she came back with this idea, I'd like to do 3 schools, and now I got a little bit concerned. We started talking about comparisons, and standing schools up beside other schools. And I'm saying, master's level work, very difficult. How do we get into these spaces? And the 3 schools she picked were very, very interesting. Really different schools, all in Leinster, but very different. The one thing they had in common was they were all using tablet technology in relation to support for kids that had been having issues and problems. That was their starting point. Okay? But they were using technology, mostly tablets, Some laptop, most have it in other interesting ways as well. So very quickly you can see one was a deaf school, the other two were not. The deaf school was a vocational school, it was the smaller of the three. There was one large urban and there was one kind of what you might call provincial town person. So an interesting mix. And the sort of subject range across the research side, quite a lot involved in maths and supporting maths, not as many as I expected in humanities. Business was high, science not a whole lot of engagement. Just interesting when you think the kind of apps that are out there on tablets. Just wasn't coming through in these schools when we did the work afterwards. But that's again neither here nor there. This was the question that set me back in the days. Yeah, that's all very well, but how do we know how they're doing as a school? You can talk to individual teachers and you can get their stories, and they're fascinating and they're fantastic, but how do we know how they're doing as a school? And I have to sit back and say, well, it's obvious, which it wasn't, to me at least. And I started and I kind of went through the known suspects. I looked initially at stuff coming out of the OECD and places like that, for indications of how you might begin to get a sense of how a school as an organisation is using technology in an innovative way. And I found very little. That's the definition that is underpinning most of the work that comes out of OECD. And OECD is important to flag here for one reason. An awful lot of the policy work that's done in this country and elsewhere has its origins and has its roots in the OECD survey definitions. The policymakers that we work with and work for take this as their starting point. A bit scary when you look at it, because it's very flat and it's not really connected to the teaching world in a lot of ways. And then the next logical thing, I looked at the inspectors' frameworks. I said, well, what are we doing here already? And I looked at the whole school frames, and I looked at the training that the inspector is getting in relation to getting a sense of how well schools are doing as schools. And again, within the walls, and I'm prepared to say that I wasn't overly impressed by what I found. Very reductionist, very minimalist, and not stuff that could do an awful lot to help schools understand where they were and how they got there. Okay? So, I then started looking for other stuff. The two started looking for other stuff, and what I want to talk about for the rest of this session is not the piece of research or the findings. I want to talk about this space that we found ourselves in, asking this question about how can we start to make sense of the story at the school level. Because I think we found some interesting stuff there that won't turn up too readily in kind of known searches. So we started this chase to what we might call use of analytical perspectives. And it started with this idea of innovative pedagogies. Let's put teaching at the centre rather than the technology. Let's work out from there. And we started kind of looking at areas to do with classroom practice, assessment, competency-based curriculum, because it's everywhere, you can't ignore it. Teacher education, it's always the teachers that are at fault. So many of these documents, and that is so wrong. Because when you look at what's in the background, the teachers are probably the least of the problems. And again, I hope to kind of stand that up as the session goes on a little bit. So all of these studies, and I'm happy to provide them afterwards to anyone who wants to have a look at them, became part of the story that we found ourselves working through. A lot of them came from this thing called the IPTS, the Institute for Perspective Technology and Society in Seville. It's a European level think tank. Not a lot of people have heard of it. There's about 500 people there, and what they do is they think. And they do really interesting research, and a lot of it connects with society and technology usage in society. So, you'll find me coming back to them. Campylus actually now works, Campylus actually now works at the IPTS. And Scienter, which is a publishing house. It's a big Italian publishing house. So it's one of the kind of, like, it's the phones of Italy, if you like, to use things as an expression. But they have an interesting idea on how to underpin technology, or sorry, how to underpin learning using technology. Okay? And the other stuff then that came through was, again, we looked at the OECD stuff because you have to. We looked at some really interesting stuff going on in Australia on learning spaces. Doesn't seem the most obvious thing, but if you change the space, and I was listening to Tom's presentation earlier, he was talking about space in the schools and wiring some parts of it and not wiring other parts. I said, this is really interesting because they're saying the same stuff in the Australian context. You power wire certain areas so that you have saturation when it comes to technology access. And you get by where you have to, if you can't actually plug the whole school. So, and then there's the New Zealand Education Reform Forum, which is also doing some very interesting work in relation to technology and spaces. And again, a lot of this comes from the work of the PUNI particular, P-U-N-I-E. That's the one name perhaps to take away from here. P-U-N-I-E, PUNI. He's the kind of the guru of the IPTS, but he's actually quite a nice guy as well. I'm hoping he'll come and speak to CESI sometime. So we settled on 3 particular frameworks that we thought we might play with. And I'm going to shoot through them. I'm going to give no justice to them, but I'm going to shoot through them, and you'll see why I think that we found it useful. The first is the Scienter framework. The second is the IPT ongoing work on CCR. Now, we have started a number of projects in Ireland in this space as well. Anne McMurrough will be known to a number of you. Anne McMurrough and Celine Healy from Maynooth are doing some really interesting stuff in this space here at the moment on creative classrooms. The results should be coming out in the next couple of months or so. And the third one then is discussion of the innovation, the system level thinking that you need to look at. And that again comes out of some IPTS work. Okay? So the Scienter framework very quickly looks like that. Wow. It's everything, and the kitchen sink. But it's interesting in the way they've organized it. Teachers are at the center. Teachers who are learning teachers, and motivated learners, equally placed at the center. So it's not about the teacher, it's not about the learner, it's about the 2 of them at the same time in the same space. That's a very interesting concept in and of itself. Working out from that, you have methods, you have the notion of the autonomy. Now, the Italians are very big on autonomy of learning. There's a huge amount of really interesting work going on in Italy on the notion of self-directed learning, autonomous learning, and so on, which is slowly finding its way into the European level discourse. Okay, and we'll hear more of it rather than anything else. There's the typical sort of stuff you would expect from a publishing house where they talk about content, but they divide it into quite interesting ways, because values is at the heart of what they're doing, not competences. And that is unusual, in my view, from publishing houses. You've got curriculum reform, you've got governance and policy making, school leadership, all those sorts of things factoring in, and here you have teaching method. The idea of pedagogy and didactics. We don't really take it seriously enough, perhaps in this country still, but they're starting to take it seriously up the food chain in other places. And then you have the notion of the valuing of the informal as well as the formal. So that was part of where we found some very, very useful push points and start points there. Okay? Think about it. How do we know that a school is doing well rather than just individual teachers within the school? Well, you start asking these questions at school level as well as at the individual teacher level. And you get some really, really interesting answers, which we actually did. Okay? And the paper will be available, I think, if you want to read it independently. The IPTS creativity thing, they've done a huge amount of work in the last sort of 8 to 9 years in terms of creativity. How am I doing for time, Sean? Okay? All right. So, 10 minutes, perfect. All right. So this is again a whiz through of the work that they've done. They say that if you want to be serious about making useful change happen, there are a number of components that have to be addressed right across the school, and not just by individual teachers. So teachers need to do them, but they need to be school-wide, which makes sense at one level. It's pretty straightforward. But then when we start shaping them out, we get a slightly different picture. And I can explain perhaps why in a moment. Content and curriculum, assessment, resources. So far so good. These are all pretty standard enough stuff. Okay? But it's the sequence in which they arrive at that is quite interesting. Next is learning practices. Not teaching practices, learning practices. Next is teaching practices. Round you go then to organizational practices. The sort of stuff that allows other stuff to happen in the schools. This is spaces, this is management, this is, access to classrooms where you don't freeze to death. Okay? Stuff like that. Then there's the values, the value base. The fact that you're even thinking about your value base is interesting. We take so much of that for granted in the Irish system, that the value base is strong. And really, perhaps now is a good time to start checking some of those. And at the heart of this, you end up then with this kind of innovative pedagogy. There's a missing piece. Now, Claire and myself thought long and hard, and we reckon the missing piece is actually leadership at the school level and beyond. So we think that's the missing piece, in a sense, in the equation. Okay? And when you break that down, you get these sorts of things. Content that is multidisciplinary, competency-based, real life, all of that is pretty straightforward. Thinking skills. has been around the block a few times, but it's starting to come back in again, and I think it's important. These schools need to kind of think hard about how we get to think more critically. Because increasingly, things like citizenship and so on is disappearing out of our curriculum. They're starting to be cut back at the road. So we need to think very carefully about producing a critical as well as a kind of an informed group. Assessment for learning, self-assessment, embedded, and so on, ICT enabled, I would say probably more than ICT, I'd say technology enabled, aligned with learning and curricula, the typical resources. Do you produce them? Do you buy them? Do you gain them? How do you use this stuff? Okay? And then within the learning frame, the personalized, the playful, the collaborative, all the stuff we don't do terribly well, and that there's very little vision about at school level. So when you start asking about these things, you get some awkward answers from principals, okay, and teachers. Okay, why are you doing this with the technology? It's very seldom about this, which is what the technology could really do. It's about, well, we need to do it so that we can get more kids, or something equally flat. Practice and so on, the one-to-one, the engagement, self-awareness, the coordinating, the values that are, and these are interesting. Equity, inclusiveness, accessibility, and caring. That's the value base that an awful lot of the work that's coming out of the content at the moment is actually directed towards. Quite interesting. A lot of it will resonate with us, but we don't really do it terribly well, perhaps. And then finally, leadership that is informed, that is trusting, that will let you have a go, that will stand back rather than see 1,000 issues with health and safety why you can't do something, that will find a way of letting it happen, and that will be supportive if you want to go off and try something a little bit different using technology. Okay, the innovative frame, I don't have time to go into it unfortunately, but think of it like this. 5 lines coming out from the centre. The local, to the regional, to the national. Right? Process to service to organisation. Single actors to multiple actors to a wide range of actors in terms of the target space. And then, this is the interesting one perhaps there from your perspective, the notion of change that is incremental, radical, up to the point of disruptive. When you start to map all of those, we do lots of pilot work, we do very, very little scaling, and we do absolutely none that takes stuff to the mainstream when it comes to technology in this country. But we're not the only ones. Because what you see here, the blue kind of shape, is a mapping of the 9 most progressive ICT projects in Europe last year. And that's where they fall on that. If they were really doing what they should be doing, the points should be out there somewhere. But look where they are. They're not. Okay, so even in the countries that are doing the cutting edge stuff, we're perhaps falling quite short of what's possible in terms of where we are. 3 minutes. So what do we find in relation to these things? If you take those ideas and drop them on the 3 schools that we looked on, what do you find? Some very interesting stuff. And again, it's pretty clear not there to talk through. But that's what we get when we look at the first one. Isn't it interesting? There's the 3 different schools. Now remember, this is a community college. This is a vocational college, and that is a typical boys' provincial town-centred secondary school. Look at the difference even in terms, that's kind of meant to be greenish. Look at the difference in the pitch, even within the 3 projects that we actually looked at. It's quite interesting when you map them like that, because we're not getting as much as we could in terms of bang for bucks out of the stuff that we're doing. We're putting all of this good technology in, but it's not having the impact it should. That's the basic message that comes out of that in a lot of ways. And it's slightly different in all 3 settings, but all of them, that's kind of interesting there. That's probably much higher than the European average. That's out beyond the European average, so will that one be, etc., etc. But you can see, that there's stuff to talk about there. There are reasons why each of those things are actually happening. And when you look at the original one then, this particular map, and you drop our 3 schools, the closer the dot is to the centre, the more conservative the position would be. The further out it is, the kind of more progressive it would be. This is not terribly scientific. I just dropped the dots, where when I looked at the schools and the feedback on the questionnaires and so on, this is where I would see them being placed. But it's quite interesting, when you look at that, even at a quick scan, the one that's doing the most is the one that has the least. It's the school with the Daesh background that has gone after technology in a limited way because they can't afford to bring in huge amounts. So what they've got, they've funded themselves very carefully. It's not a BYOD school. It's a funded school. Okay? But that's the one that's coming closest to doing interesting and cool stuff, in my view and in Claire's view. And, you know, if you want to chase it down, you can contact either of us and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But I thought it was intriguing to see, you know, how far we've come and how far we still have to go when it comes to this rather easily missed elephant in the room. We concentrate so much on the teachers and what the teachers do, and a lot of people tell the teachers what they should be doing. And organizations like this are fantastic because, you know, it's about the teacher and her classroom, the teacher and his classroom. Okay? But we have a lot to do at the system level, at the process level, and at the policy level, because that, in many ways, is where it's not happening. It's not the teachers that are letting us down very often. It's further up the food chain. And I think that's a message that kind of is not reaching the right ears often enough. And that's my talking to our Anne Claire's. And I said, hope she's enjoying her bloody wedding in Italy. But if you want to chase it down, I can push it through. I can't put her email address up because she's a student, obviously, just finished student. So, but I'm happy to pass on anyone's contact points to her if you wish to speak to her about her work and where else she'll be speaking. She will be speaking at a Psychology of Education conference in the near future. Thank you for that, folks.